Hey, we're live. Welcome to the pre-show, folks. Hey, good to see you. Thank you for putting up with last night where we had an internet crash, but we were back up before morning, so we are up and rolling today, just as normal. Good to see everybody. Hey, Teresa. Good to see you. I haven't seen you for a long time. And Susie Q, and Leslie Holker, and Niall Parkinson, and Barbie D, and everybody else that's coming in. Elderberry, how you doing? And Milky Way is here, Robert V. And who else we got? Anyway, they're coming in. That's a bunch of you. So welcome. Let me make sure things are rolling here. Rolling, rolling, rolling. Keep them doggies rolling. My windows are all wonky here. Let me get them unwonky. There's that. Okay. We're pretty much ready to roll. I'm going to start the, there it is. You see here the feedback. That is for the radio station live link. That will pick up at 4 minutes and 26 seconds after the top of the hour. So how you all doing tonight? Here is Ro wants to come on and show. You saw a bit of the new cat last night. There's the new kitty, and there he is. Come on. That is.
He's gonna step on your keyboard.
Yeah, that's because you got him right here. That's Bob Saget.
No,
folks.
it's not.
Bob Saget.
Everybody calls him Bing Bong. Literally,
You call him Bing Bong.
Mom calls him Bing Bong.
So there he is. New kitty. Brand new kitty.
Call him Bing Bong now.
There you go.
Yeah, Ellery even.
He likes to crawl on top of me and sleep on me.
Yeah, he likes
So-
to do this too. If you put him over your shoulder, crawl on your back.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then his claws, he likes to hang on to you if he thinks he's going to fall.
I just clipped his.
That's why I don't do that with my bare shoulders.
I just-
Hey, Paige.
I just-
Bob Saget.
Don't sit on.
One word, Bob Saget.
Come here.
So, hey, Bob Saget, everybody's saying. So that was the condition, by the way. I said, we don't need another cat. We need another cat like we all need another hole in the head. And so, Captain America. That's me tonight. Ro chose this shirt out for me because she said, look, Mom, this goes with that pair of underpants you got, Dad. And she got me a pair of boxers like this last year. I don't know if y'all remember that. So 2 years ago, maybe by now. So I now have the matching shirt. So there it is. It's a hoodie. It's got a nice big belly pocket on it and a hood. So it's good stuff. Niall Parkin says, Bing Bong Bob, nice cat. That's what she wants to call him. Bing Bong Bob.
No, that's what Mom wants to call him. That's what Mom calls him.
No, Mom went along with me.
No, she
I said,
didn't.
the only way we're getting a new cat is if we can name it Bob Saget. That's my only condition.
She never calls him Bob Saget. She only
Not
says
to your
Bing Bong
face.
Bob.
Not to your face, she doesn't.
She only calls him Bob Saget when you're around.
She tells me he's fine. Yeah, you can believe whatever you want.
I will.
So,
He's my cat.
There you
My
go.
son.
Okay, off with you. See ya. You too. Shut that down, please. What do you mean, no?
Ellery, it's time for bed anyway.
I got to go on radio in 10 seconds. Going dark. Stand by, folks.
The Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with two T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad, so he can take me to Disneyland.
You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Happy Tuesday evening, folks. Welcome to the program. I am your host, Scotty Roberts, and this is the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio, ODYSY radio.com. And you can find us over in Facebook on 3 different locations, and of course at my YouTube page. It's youtube.com/Scotty Roberts. And if you're there, subscribe if you're not subscribed, for heaven's sake. And if you are subscribed, like this broadcast tonight. It helps us with all our junk going on over there at YouTube. And as I've mentioned before, this show doesn't make a lot of money. It's not my living, but it would be nice to be able to pay for itself for the costs we do put out. And by you giving me a thumbs up, that helps propagate these shows even more. So if you're here and you're listening and you're a regular attendee and you like these shows, give it a thumbs up. I appreciate it. And you know what? If you're all those things already and you want to join the channel, click on the little join button down below. And you'll see what you can do to become a joined member of this channel. I'm not an American, says Niall Parkinson over in Ireland, but I think that hoodie is fraggin' awesome. It is awesome. Look at this thing. It's got the big eagle on it with the eagle eye and all the stuff. It's great. It's a great, everybody's shouting in the house, and that, of course, picks up on the radio. So I just thought I'd say that loud enough so all the people shouting in the house can hear that upstairs. Yeah, we're still a rinky-dink operation. We've been going for a few years. 22 in total, but 3.5 in this incarnation on Odyssey Radio. And but you get the personal side on this show. You get my familial interruptions. You get kids yelling, wife yelling, dogs barking, cats meowing, birds chirping, fish glubbing, whatever they do. So welcome to it. This is it. This is my life. This is my show. And 22 years, Sarah. Been going since 2000, doing one form of this show or the other. 2000 was the year I was doing paranormal radio with somebody out of Oklahoma City. And then I went into doing political shows. And then by 2009, I was working for the Ghost Hunters. And when I left the Ghost Hunters as editor-in-chief of their magazine in late 2010, in early 2011, launched Intrepid magazine. And shortly thereafter came Intrepid Radio, the new incarnation of everything we'd been doing up to that point. And that's what we've been doing off and on for years, ever since then. And so, boom, Captain, 22 years, says Susie Q. Thank you. And you'd think we'd have it perfected by now, But of course, none of the children that make noise on this show at night were alive 22 years ago. They've only grown up with this show for the last 10 years, and really the last 3.5 in its current incarnation. I used to pre-record all my shows when they were all gone at school or sleeping or whatever. So that's the way it goes. And see, as if summoned by the angels themselves, look who wanders into my screen. There she is. There's Ellie here. Slide over a little bit. There's Ellie with
A kitty in a
Bob Saget in her shirt. So
Bing bong.
bing bong Bob Saget. All right, thanks. I love you. Good night.
He's my baby.
Come here. Good night. I love you. Go to bed.
He's my
It's
baby.
time.
He's my
School
baby.
tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ellery Roberts has left the studio. So she's heading upstairs. So that's the one, especially, that likes to take advantage of the fact that I'm on the radio and she knows I can't do the things I would normally do to discipline because I'm in front of a public audience. Well, I'll have you know, I haven't spanked her in a long time because I think there's an age where it gets to be too old and there's other ways to discipline. But she definitely takes advantage. So welcome, all of that to say welcome to the program tonight. And we're getting into some of our old fare tonight, some of the things that I really like talking about. And when I actually spoke to Sarah Yusuf a bit yesterday, it was last night maybe, or was it this morning? You texted and asked if anything about the Exodus from other cultures other than Egyptian or Israelite. And I did not have a chance today to go into any of that in any great detail. I know it is that the Exodus is mentioned in other cultures. We'll hit on a little bit of that tonight, but not very much quite yet. So tonight, I want to talk about the Exodus, but proofs of the Exodus. Teresa, I saw that you said something early on in the chat room about, oh, yes, this is something you want to see, these evidences, new evidences for the Exodus having happened. Well, there's not new evidences. It's really old evidence that's always been there with a little bit of a newer understanding on it in recent years. And that's some of the locations in the conquest along the way. And you all know what the conquest was if you know anything about the story. The conquest, of course, is the story of when Joshua took over after Moses' death, 40 years of sojourning in the wilderness, wandering in the wilderness, you could call it, or what did the Hebrews do? They were basically a nomadic tribe in the Sinai for years, for 40 years. It was supposed to be until that generation that left Egypt died out and a new generation was in its place. So some of the kids that were born in that first year after the Exodus, now they're 39, 40 years old at this time. Joshua was a stone cutter back in Egypt when they were slaves. And so Joshua is probably at this time 60 to 70 years old, maybe a little younger. Maybe he was only in his late teens, early 20s at the time of the Exodus. So you've got Joshua taking over, and you've got the sacking of Jericho and the sacking of all these little towns and villages that they went in and went to war against to what? To take the land by force. This is the land that God promised us, so we're going to take this land by force, is the idea behind the conquest. And so God is saying, this is your promised land. I promised it to you. I gave it to you. It's yours. Now go fight for it and conquer it. So, you know what pops into mind? I'm not being too flippant. I'm just making a joke, but Captain Kirk, one of them, excuse me, what does God need with a starship? So, I almost want to ask the same question. God, if you gave this land to your chosen people, your children, why did they have to mount armies to conquer it back or to conquer it in the first place? Because it was just Israel, Jacob, who lived there with his family clan. They didn't own the whole territory, but God promised it to them. So now they got to go take it. So it's like God saying, I promised you this land. Now you got to go win it. Okay. And so they mount their armies up. And yeah, God, exactly, Matthew Sainsbury. Yeah, God in the real estate business. So there it is. God was so very concerned with boundaries. And we see so many human attributes given to God in the Old Testament that we miss the fact that he's supposed to be God and the creator of all things, because he acts an awful lot like a guy sometimes. But I'm not going to question that tonight. That's not the purpose of this. But this is some of this information I'm drawing from you is in the last 20 years or so is where this, and I've got the Exodus itinerary, meaning if you could take the travel itinerary of the whole Exodus and spread it out on a map and take a look at it, which, by the way, I was going to have some maps tonight, and they are wiped out for some reason. We'll go into that. I'd have to reburn them all. But the Exodus itinerary is confirmed now by Egyptian evidence, and that's what I want to go into. And the Exodus from Egypt is not a distant topic in this show. Because why did Joseph lose his coat? Because his brothers were jealous of him. There it is. Yeah, Joseph, the first of the Canaanites of Jacob's family, Israel, the first of his family to go down to Egypt. He went down as a slave. His brothers sold him into slavery because they were jealous of him. Nice brothers, huh? And yet what happens in that story we know? And Joseph, 20 years later, he's risen to power. He's a grand vizier in Egypt. Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh, one step off the throne. More than likely, and I mean that by saying I'm 100% convinced, that it was during the reign of the Hyksos kings, that 108-year period that he was raised to power, because the Hyksos were really of the same lineage as Joseph. And so Joseph is down there in Egypt. His brothers come. They come seeking refuge during the drought. Joseph's the farthest thing from their mind in Egypt. But who do they run across? The grand vizier that gets to grant them land is none other than their brother Joseph, who reveals himself later. What does Joseph do? He saves them. He gives them the land. He does, and these are the guys that sold him into slavery years before. So you've got that whole story that Dave just brought up. But the Exodus from Egypt itself, a few hundred years later, was followed by the invasion and the conquest of Palestine. And it lies at the heart, and Palestine, I slip into using that word sometimes. I don't see it as Palestine. Palestine was something that existed 100 to 150 years ago. It was a land that was there. That was not the land during the time of Joseph, during the time of Israel, during the time of the Exodus. That land was Canaan, and it was the Canaanites who dwelt there. And so the conquest of Canaan after the Exodus lies at the heart of the whole biblical account of Israel's origins. And there's a number of modern scholars, however, and many modern scholars, that reject the entire story of the Exodus. In their view, it's little more than a pious fabrication that was written hundreds of years after the events described in the biblical accounts. And the scriptures, as Robert P. Coote puts it succinctly, do not contain an accurate historical account of Israel's origin and early history. So in the words of another exponent of this school of thought, Thomas L. Thompson, Israel's own tradition is radically irrelevant to writing a history of Israel's origins. And so he says, that's his take on it. And so I want to examine, there are 3 sites that are described in 3 different biblical passages, as well as some of the evidence that supposedly undermines the historical accuracy of the biblical account, and examine those for a bit, because these are some key sites, geographical sites, that the exponents of the Exodus would say proves that it didn't really happen the way it's written. And I think this would be interesting. If if you grew up learning any of this stuff, if you want to know this stuff, I think this is very interesting information. And for me, it goes back to the historical efficacy of what we see contained in the Bible today. You may disagree with the faith story. You may be of a different faith, but that does not render the historical accounts in the Bible as purely fiction. I think that they were accurate historical accounts with faith stories wrapped around them, saying this is the history of our people. Now, the first of these three sites is a place called Dibon, D-I-B-O-N, and it's east of the Jordan River. Now, if you get a look at a map of Israel, and I don't have these maps available tonight, sorry, you'll see Israel, and you'll see the Dead Sea is down here at the bottom, and the Jordan River goes up to the Sea of Galilee. And so the Jordan River. So east of Jordan today is the country of Jordan. But it says, mentioned in the passage Numbers 33, that Dibon, east of the Jordan, where the invading Israelites are said to have encamped. And the excavation of Tel Dibon, D-H-I-B-A-N, ancient Dibon, has revealed no city was there in the late Bronze Age, which is about 1400 to 1200 BCE. Now, I place the Exodus around 1446, as do many other scholars who follow the traditional calendar and look at it in comparison to the Egyptian chronology of the kings. So, but 1400 be a little late. They said there was nothing there during that period. And so when the Exodus supposedly occurred during that period, but nothing was found there earlier than the 9th century BCE. You subtract 9 from 14, instead of 1400s BCE, 900s BCE. You got 500 years before there's any significant civilization there, supposedly. And so how could the Israelites encamp at and presumably conquer the city of Dibon, which apparently did not exist at the time when the Exodus and the conquest was to have taken place? That's one of the sites. Niall says, Palestine is an Arab word. It's a word of acquisition or entitlement due to conquest or movement of peoples due to the same. And Palestine became theirs because they were the squatters in the sand bowl, which is all it was at the time. And Israel, modern day Israel, was founded on those that were going back and settling there. The kibbutzes in the early 1900s, all the way up to the time of World War II, then the resettlement of European Jews there. And in 1948-49 is when Israel became a nation or a state by a UN vote. And that's what exists there today. So now the second of these sites, the first was Dibon. The second was Hebron. That might be a name that you're familiar with if you're familiar at all with the biblical stories of the Old Testament. So according to the Bible, Moses sent spies to reconnoiter Hebron in preparation for the Israelite invasion. And they went up into the Negev and came to Hebron. That's in Numbers 13:22. And when the invasion came, Hebron was a principal target. Joshua 10, 37, 11, and Judges 1 all speak of this. So again, the skeptics call on the archaeologists to support their case. There was no city at Hebron in the late Bronze Age, 1400 to 1200 BCE. So how could they have conquered a city that didn't exist there? And the third site is Kishon, Qishon, which figures in the accounts of Deborah's war against a Canaanite alliance led by Jabin, the king of Hatzor. And here we find a significant agreement between the Bible and real history. You'll find that in the book of Judges. Deborah was a judge in early Israel before the time of the kings. So now Numbers 33, if you look at that book, that chapter, that book, it's kind of a dusty, dry, matter-of-fact listing of the sites on the Exodus route. And the latter part of the chapter describes the Israelite invasion of the Transjordan, the east of the Jordan. That was a prelude to the conquest of all Palestine. And the account, while it sounds credible enough, even authoritative, as if based on real and reliable sources, it certainly creates in the mind of even the most critical reader the impression of historical fact. And after all, the historian is absolute and specific. He or she describes the Transjordan route the invaders took in quite a remarkable detail. And it was station by station, from the Arabah, the desolate region south of the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, to the plains of Moab, that's the lower Jordan Valley, to Eiyam, and Dibon, and Almon Diblathim, Nebo, Abel Shittim, and finally the Jordan River. This is all in the book of Numbers, chapter 33. You find all of this. So on the face of it, this passage is really, Numbers 33, a really impressive and credible piece of ancient historical writing. Traditional biblical scholars always regarded it as such. And for them, the account's extraordinary specificity. Specificity. Say that faster. Specificity. There you go. It's extraordinary specificity. That's one of those words that has too many in it. And then throwing an F in there too. So extraordinary specificity. And the precision of detail in these historical accounts in Numbers 33 strongly indicates that the ancient historian who wrote it had sources that accurately preserved the memory of a road used in very early times, and not inconceivably in the late Bronze Age. And that's well worth noting. Now, present day academic detractors, I don't want to say they're not all poo on the Bible and your God. It's not that. They're historians, and they say we're a detractor historically because we want to piece this history together too. But of these traditional scholars, they often portray them as unsophisticated, naive, or simply ideological paraphrasers of the Bible. That's who the guys who believe in what the Bible says about this history. So in fact, they were anything but. They were just given to the intellectual conviction that a nation's own historical literature is, in the words of the eminent contemporary classical historian and historiographer, Arnaldo Mamigliano. I needed Rocky here for that one. Arnaldo Mamigliano. And he said, by all the principles of historical research and criteria of common sense, the most important source of knowledge for the history of that nation is the Bible. And Thompson, on the other hand, Tommy Thompson, he essentially ignores the early history of the Israelite people that's written by the Israelites themselves in the Bible. And in his massive volume on the subject entitled Early History of the Israelite People from the Written and Archaeological Sources. That came out in 1992, by the way. The book is as much of a tome as the title sounds. And so according to Gösta Ahlström, who with the umlauts on both his names, who was still, until his recent death, he was also a member of the rejectionist school. It's quite clear that the biblical writers knew nothing about events in Palestine before the 10th century BCE, he says, which is the time of King David and King Solomon and the monarchy. And this is indicated, Ahlström said, by the plain fact that non-Israelite inscriptional material from the late Bronze Age contains, he says, not a shred of evidence confirming any event or the existence of any person mentioned in the biblical account of Israel's origins. So in other words, the Israelites who wrote about Israelite origins got their own history wrong, is what he's saying. Yeah, catchy title, isn't it, Sarah? Just when you throw out at a tea party, you know. Oh, say, have you ever read in early history of the Israelite people from the written and archaeological sources? I have. Let's cover it in our next book club. So he says that nobody knows anything about the history of Israel, especially the Israelites. And this is indicated, Ahlstrom said, by the plain fact that non-Israelite inscriptional material from the late Bronze Age contains not one shred of evidence that confirms any of the events of the existence of any person mentioned in the biblical account of Israel's origins. So the Bible story does not even reflect any real knowledge of the geography of Palestine, he goes on, in the late Bronze Age. And to support this thesis, Ahlstrom cites the invasion route of the Israelites in Numbers 33, 45 through 50. The very specificity of detail in the narrative that an earlier generation perceived as evidence of its historicity is, for Ahlstrom, irrefutable evidence of the opposite. He was not the first to make this argument, but he strongly concurred with it. And others did of like conviction, that there's too much accurate detail, or too much detail, therefore, to be accurate, especially now that we look at things. And so among the Transjordan cities were the invading Israelites. They encamped there, in which they presumably besieged and attacked. And that was Dibon, that town of Dibon, the city. But this can't be, according to him. According to the rejectionists, for an actual fact, there was no late Bronze Age strata were found at the Tell of Dibon. And some remains from 1200 to 1100 were found on the summit of the Tell, but a city did not exist before the 9th century BCE. And so it's true that excavations at Dibon, ancient Dibon, just different spellings, Dhiban in modern day, Dibon in the biblical account, mainly in the 1950s, they uncovered no late Bronze Age remains at all. And so Israelite historical tradition is therefore, according to the rejectionists, wrong. So what you find in the Bible about the route of the Exodus and the conquest is wrong, according to the historical rejectionists. But does the failure of a team of archaeologists to find a late Bronze Age stratum at the ruins of ancient Dibon lead to the conclusion that no city ever existed there at the site between 1300 and 1200 BCE? And if one holds to the biblical tradition, the archaeology of Dibon reveals only that the late Bronze Age city, the city of Joshua, has not yet been found. And the lack of any late bronze remains at Dibon is one of the linchpins, however. The distinguished Palestinian archaeologist William Deaver's conclusion that there was no Israelite conquest of Canaan. So now, the big question comes up. Did Dibon exist in the late Bronze Age? The rejectionists say no, that there is no archaeological evidence of anything before 900 BCE. So does the road through the Transjordan described in Numbers 33 reflect historical reality or historical fiction? And that's the question that's been asked for years on this. Sarah said, no, these societies were not in bubbles. There was trade and cultural exchange as well. Yes. Niles said before her, I think you can draw parallels with ex-Canaan Gospels, which were extremely specific too. In the case of the Israelites, they left a trail behind, which is just as obvious. Yes. So, in biblical studies, truth is often only a matter of personal opinion, according to rejectionists, or it's a test of scholarly perceptions, or of this momentary consensus that's out there. However, in the case of the claim of the biblical tradition, that at the time of Joshua, there was a Jordanian route of Ayam Diban Alman Dibalthayim Nebo Abel Jordan, there is a witness who has not yet been called to testify. And that witness who knows the truth, and that's Egypt, of all places. Now, here's where we dig into this meat a little bit. What about these three towns I just mentioned? If Joshua conquered them, why are they not mentioned in history? Why does it seem like they apparently did not exist at that period? So in the late Bronze Age, Egypt ruled Palestine, or Canaan, if you will, the Middle East. And in the course of its 300-year jurisdiction, that's dynasties 18 through dynasties 29 or 19. Now, 18 is where I place Senenmut and Hatshepsut and the Tutmosean dynasty and so on, and the Exodus during the 18th dynasty. And that would be roughly 1560 all the way down to 1200 BCE. So Egypt mapped the region thoroughly, and included in these maps were all the main roads of Palestine, among them an important fixed route through Transjordan that linked the Arabah and the plains of Moab. And this road was in continuous use throughout the entirety of the late Bronze Age. Now, during this entire period, its course remained constant. It didn't change. This route from Egypt into the Jordan. And it was scrupulously maintained by Egypt, not merely for access to its Transjordanian principalities, but also for access to Palestine or Cisjordan from the east. So don't confuse this road with the so-called King's Highway through Transjordan that's also mentioned in the Bible. There's also a King's Highway that went up on the west side of the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, and went from all the way down in Egypt between the coast and where Jerusalem is now, those plains all the way up through there and up into Asia Minor. But so don't confuse this road with that one. That's the King's Highway. The King's Highway was the great north-south road from Syria to northern Arabia. And the Arabia and the Arabah to the plains of Moab road, on the other hand, was a relatively short route that served a specific function to get the traveler from the region immediately south of the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea, I'm sorry, not Red Sea, sounds the same, the Dead Sea, to the Jordan River across from Jericho. So these ancient Egyptian maps have survived in a list form, and each list contains the names of the cities along the road, and transcribed from the original map in its precise sequence. And these were then combined with numerous similar maps into longer typographical lists inscribed on the walls of ancient Egyptian temples. 3 such maps of the road from the Arabah to the plains of Moab road have come down to us. None is complete, that is, none contains all of the stations along the road, but the individual maps complement one another. And when the stations they list are all collated, we get a fairly complete picture of the road, all the way from the southern end of the Dead Sea to the Jordan River. And so the earliest of the 3 maps comes from the reign of Tutmosis III. Tutmosis III was the stepson of Hatshepsut, the son of Tutmosis II, her husband, who died, brother as well, and she became co-regent with the 3 to 6 year old Tutmosis III and took over 6 years later. Hatshepsut became the pharaoh of Egypt. And Tutmosis grew up in the north in Memphis and was the general of all her armies. We've talked about him at great extent. And his son, in his older years, his son became pharaoh, Amenhotep II. He was, I believe, the pharaoh of the Exodus. So the earliest of the 3 maps comes from the reign of Tutmosis III. And he ruled from roughly 1504 BCE to 1450 BCE. And inscribed in the Temple of Amun at Karnak as part of the so-called Palestine list. And this is the greatest of the Egyptian topographical lists. I've seen it. This list on this wall in Karnak of all the cartouches of all these different kingdoms that were conquered. And this is the greatest of the Egyptian topographical lists, and it contains 119 place names associated with numerous routes in Palestine, Transjordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And the route of the Arabah to the plains of Moab names in order from south to north, 4 stations: Ayin, Diban, Abel, and Jordan. And it's not difficult to recognize this route in Numbers 33. And the names are so similar all the way through. And 2 other late Bronze Age Egyptian maps neatly complement the Thutmose III map. The Thutmose map dates to the late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1400. The other 2 date to the late Bronze Age 2A, which is 1400 to 1300, and the late Bronze Age 2B from 1300 to 1200. Thus, the road is documented throughout the entire late Bronze Age period, is the point I'm making. And the older of the 2 maps dates to the reign of Amenephis III, who ruled in 1387 and on. And it's inscribed in his mortuary temple at Soleb. It contains 3 stations listed in the north-south direction: Akrabat, Hareseth, and Melech. And the latter means salt and refers to the Salt Sea or the Dead Sea. And so the youngest of the 3 extant maps of this road dates to the reign of Ramses II, the mistaken pharaoh of the Exodus, because of certain passages, which we've talked about before. And so it's part of a 49-name topographical list inscribed on the west side of the entrance of the Great Hall of the Temple of Armon at Karnak. And it lists 4 stations in a south-north direction: Heres, Quaro, Iktanu, and Abel. Now, Quaro is another name. Get this. Guess what Quaro is another name for? Diban, the missing town. And so in the famous Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone, the 9th century Moabite king Mesha regularly calls Diban Quaro. And in this inscription, Mesha uses the name Diban exclusively for his political state. But Diban and Quaro seem to have been used interchangeably as names for the same city. And although Ramses II here calls the city Quaro, he calls it Diban in a historical inscription, to which I'm going to get back to that if we make it that far tonight. It's kind of like in older times, over a century and a half ago, the city of St. Paul, where I lived for so long, the capital city of Minnesota, was known as Pig's Eye. And those 2 names for years were used, even though they changed the name. They made it a religious name, obviously, St. Paul. And those 2 names were used interchangeably, Pig's Eye and St. Paul. And Minneapolis had something similar. I know New York was once New Amsterdam, and so on. We talked about all those similes in names when we were talking about the Israelites having built the treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, built by Ramses II. Well, no, they built Avaris, the city that Ramses, 200 years later, acquired and rebuilt. So in 2 of the 3 inscriptions of these maps, we have irrefutable primary historical evidence for the existence of the city of Diban in the late Bronze Age, even though they say that there was no city that existed there. So in addition, a number of ancient site names have survived in their modern names. Biblical Ayim, it's Iyyim, Ayim. Egyptian Ayin survives in the modern village of Ai. Biblical and Egyptian Diban survives as Diban, Dhiban. Iktanu is the present-day ruin called Tel Iktanu. And when the 3 Egyptian lists are combined, we acquire a nearly complete road map. And it went like this. It went Yam, or Hamelach, to Iayin, to Heres, or Hareseth, or Kerek, it was also called, Akabet, Diban, or Quaro, Iktanu, Abel, and Jordan. So in short, the biblical story of the invasion of the Transjordan that set the stage for the conquest of all of Palestine, or Canaan, if you will, is told against a background that is historically accurate. It's geographically accurate. It's cartologically accurate. It's cartologically accurate. So the Israelite invasion route described in Numbers 33 was in fact an official, heavily trafficked Egyptian road through the Transjordan in the late Bronze Age. It'd be almost like the armies of Israel, led by Joshua, just marching down the used highway. They went down the highway and went from town to town and sacked them, took them over. And the city of Dibon was, in fact, a station on that road. And Dibon, by the way, wasn't a silent ruin along this road. Ramses II tells us that he sacked the city in the course of a military campaign in Moab, leaving us with no doubt that Dibon was there at that time, 150 years after the supposed Exodus. And it was occupied and worth sacking by Ramses II. Hey, that city's worth sacking. Let's go. Take it. And to date, archaeologists may not have found its ruins, but it surely existed. And so finally, there's a note on Abel. When Joseph took his embalmed father, Jacob, when they left Israel, Joseph took his embalmed father, Jacob, from Egypt to Hebron, in order to bury him, not the Exodus. Joseph wasn't alive during the Exodus. Yada, yada. Don't let me mix myself up. When he took his father, Jacob, from Egypt to Hebron in order to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, which you can still visit today. It's a name place that still exists. The funeral procession stopped at a Transjordan site identified as Abel Mitzrayim, or Abel of the Egyptians. And at that time, as we now know from our Egyptian sources, the city was still under Egyptian administration, or its Egyptian past was still warm in the memory of the biblical historian or those he consulted. This was most likely the late Bronze Age. So Hebron was a major target in the Israelite conquest of Canaan. As we're told in the book of Joshua, Joshua and all of Israel with him went up against Hebron and fought against it and seized it. That's Joshua chapter 10. Exciting reading, by the way. If you want to read a historical religious book, that's got some cool stuff in it. And again, Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. That's Judges 1. The biblical account is emphatic. In the time of Moses and Joshua, Hebron was a city of considerable importance in the mountains of South Canaan. And for this reason, it inevitably became right under Israelite attack. Israeli would denote that the country already existed. So, did Hebron even exist in late Bronze Age? Is the question. Alstrom and his historians of his school doubt the biblical writers knew what they were talking about, because there were almost no inhabitants during the late Bronze Age period in the geography territory called Judah. Now, Alstrom relies on archaeologists like Israeli archaeologist Amihai Matzar, who concluded, based on the archaeological record, that the late Bronze occupation of Judah was very poor or completely non-existent. Another Israeli archaeologist, Israel Finkelstein, he stated, no Israelite settlement sites are known in the southern Hebron Hills. At the beginning of the Iron One, around 1200 BCE. And in the Beersheba Valley, Israelite settlement did not begin until the 11th century BCE. And even then, only on a limited scale, says Finkelstein. That leaves the problem of the biblical tradition of the penetration into Judah from the south. The surprising dearth of sites in the Beersheba Valley and in the southern Hebron Hills seems to preclude any large-scale influx of elements from that direction. And so if there were connections, he says, with southern groups, their archaeological expression was negligible. Only at the beginning of the 10th century BCE, as settlement in Judah burgeoned, did the southern centers rise in importance, he says. Hebron and David's selection of Jerusalem, or the city of Salem, as his capital. So thus, nothing in the archaeological record would lead one to believe that in Joshua's time, late Bronze Age 2B, Hebron was an important city. And relying on the archaeological evidence alone, as Ahlstrom thinks, clearly early Israelite history should and must be written, is it any wonder that one scholar, William Steebing, concludes, quote, as at other sites, the absence of late Bronze Age remains at Hebron indicates either that the Exodus and the conquest did not take place during the late Bronze Age or that the biblical accounts of those events are not historically accurate. But the Egyptian maps tell another story. Before looking at these maps, you need to look at the topographical list in Joshua chapter 15. The list, and it lists the cities of Judah in southern Canaan. And in this region were 5 districts, each with its own capital. Hebron was the capital of the 2nd district, according to Joshua 15, which boasted 9 cities and their villages clustered around Hebron. And so you can return to the topographical list of Ramses II. Unfortunately, some of the names on the list that have been completely effaced on the temples. Other names include only the initial letter. Unfortunately, however, about a century after this list was carved on the walls of the Amun temple, Ramses III ordered the list to be copied as part of a great topographical list on a wall of his mortuary temple at Menedot Habu, which I've been there and seen this list. That's in Luxor. And there we can read some of the effaced names of the Ramses II list, copied over by his successor, Ramses III. We've only got about 4 minutes left on this program, 3 minutes actually. And so we're not going to make it through all the rest of the material I have here. But I also, it's just kind of letting you know, the accounts in Judges, the accounts in Joshua, the accounts in these passages contain specific historical, geographical information about the late Bronze Age, whose accuracy is dramatically validated by the Egyptian documents of that time. And there indeed was a king named Jabin. The places mentioned in the biblical accounts did in fact exist at the time, and none of these pieces of information was fabricated. If the biblical writers of these stories knew so well what they were talking about, did the writers of the other biblical accounts of conquest also know what they were talking about? And that's something you have to ask yourself when you look at all this. And there's so many other cities here and different places that are all tied into all these little regions we talked about. So is there proof that the conquest took place? Not by a listing saying, and Joshua went here, then he went there. That's the biblical account. The proof you have is in the archaeological evidence. And that archaeological evidence is in the maps and the inscriptions that were created. Sometimes there was a map that followed the route and the river and all of that. Other times, they listed them as text and all of that, pictures and text relaying this information. And so, just a second. So anyway, here we go. I just had a message pop in and I had to make sure it wasn't somebody asked something about this. So there you go, folks. There is the entire, the look in its entirety of these 3 major cities that were always in question because they couldn't find archaeological evidence that they existed. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. The archaeological evidence that they existed might not be in the tells where they dug up the cities. They might have the wrong location. It exists in the ancient Egyptian maps, the ancient Egyptian inscriptions. All of those named places are listed there. And so I think that that's something that's well worth taking into consideration if you're looking at the biblical account of the Exodus. So to me, and there's so much more on this topic of the Exodus and establishing it with outside sources. It doesn't have to mention Joshua. It doesn't have to mention God of the Israelites. All it has to mention is a name place on a map that corresponds with something that they said didn't exist. Then they find out it corresponds with the biblical account. So there you go. So I hope you enjoyed this, folks. This stuff is my cup of tea. I love this stuff. Getting into history and archaeology and looking at things and saying, did this happen this way or did it not happen that way? And so it's well worth looking at. So all of you on the radio over at Odyssey, thank you for being here. Join us for the Captain's Cabin right after this over on the YouTube channel. In the meantime, live long and prosper.
Join us every weeknight at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, 10 p.m. Eastern. The Intrepid Radio Program, a Scotty Roberts Productions broadcast.
Are you looking for a really awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAllenRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, ALANROBERTS.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad so he can take me to Disneyland.
Avast, folks. Welcome to the Captain's Cabin. Arr. Good to have you aboard. How you doing? What you doing back there? Nothing? You know it's 10 o'clock?
Yeah.
You know it's way past your bedtime?
Yeah.
How come you're up? I don't know. Is Mom upstairs? You don't know? So you're all on your own? Where's brother and sister? In bed? Where's Mom? In bed? I don't know. Well, good night. Say hi to everybody and tell me good night. I'll see you later.
The dog attacked Bing Bong.
Yeah, the dog's stupid. So, but the cat let her have it. So that's good. Lucy needs to be put in her place. She is the killer of small animals. So, bulldog and pug put together, and you got the idea. So, Susie Q says, Ellery, sleepy girl. And hi to you again, says Barbie D. Uncle Dave says, shouldn't you be in bed?
No.
Yeah, I think you should be. Dave, you should come on and let her know. So, because Mom and Dad both say it's time for bed. It's 10 o'clock at night.
When Rowan and Mom are still like.
Okay, you got to get it for school in the morning, okay? Good night. Bye. I love you. See you later. Bye. Go upstairs. Oh gosh, I'm really sorry. Yeah, I'm weeping inside. All right. Pull this out of my pocket. Folks, for the next 2 days, starting tomorrow morning, I'm going to be up at Andy's up in the North Woods, hopefully putting some final details on some things. And so we'll do the show from up there. Probably from a hotel room up there this time because they had cleaned out that downstairs area. It's not a guest room anymore. They're doing other stuff with it. So he said, I'm just going to put you up in a hotel. So that's what I'll be doing. So, yeah, Santa could be listening. I think she's right on that cusp, Susie Q, of the Santa, non-Santa thing. She knows too much about what's going on in the world. Rudy Kessler, are you having a better night, Scotty? I am, Rudy. A much better night than last night. Hey, Paige Rockwell. Good to see you. Rockwell Sui. There's Sarah Yusuf. Let's bring her in. Kazam. There you are.
Hey, Scotty.
Hi, Sarah. How's it going?
I think I'm getting a cold, but I'm all right now.
Uh-oh. Well, that's not cool.
If I sound weird, let me know.
One by one, my children are all going to come down now. Well, Flynn never does. He doesn't have to.
He is not a happy cat.
Well, I suppose not. Let me see him.
I just put him in the shower.
Come here. Oh, well, I don't want a wet cat. What are you doing? Oh. All right. So, scram, guys.
No.
No. Why? It's bedtime.
No, it's not.
Do I need to turn off the show and help you understand that better?
No, because we need to clean the cat and dog, so we're not going to bed for a while.
That's what you think. Hey, Sarah, hang on for a second.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, you can take the show for a second. I'll be right here.
Uh-oh. Need Uncle Dave here to help me out. No? Okay. Well, I'll just start talking about the Exodus, which is, a very interesting concept. In that, in the entire culture of, the Hebrew people prior to their arrival in Egypt and everything. And hey, Scotty.
Hey, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
It's been so long. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had already established concepts of, the Messiah and this land promised to land promised to the Hebrew people and all that.
Yeah.
And so I found it interesting. It's like a type of manifest destiny that's given to this particular group of people.
Yeah.
And, it's those concepts of being God's quote unquote chosen people, as opposed to, because these cultures, they don't live within a bubble. There's other.
You don't think of it in the same terms as manifest destiny, but it is.
Yeah. So and it's not like the whole area was empty and they just plopped down there. There were already rival tribes, competing for resources, all this stuff, and it's that concept that God wanted us to find this land and everything. So we'll go up against whatever hardships or whatever, and just take if they win the battle that they considered, we were meant to do that. We were meant to take over other peoples and either absorb them into their own tribes or take over other areas, like that sort of conflict that exists right now with the current thing with Palestine and Israel.
Well, certainly a lot of people fell before them.
Right. Yeah,
yes.
Certainly.
I just have to say, Paige, sorry about that. You corrected me once and told me how to say your name, and I never get it right. So, Sway. All I got to remember is Sway. I'll remember that. Oui, says Field Guy. I will not forget your name now.
You never get my name right either. That doesn't stop me.
Yusuf? How do you say your last name?
Yusuf.
No, yeah. It's like Joseph.
Yeah.
So, sorry about that.
It's okay.
I have my own way of pronouncing things. I'm
Yeah.
sorry none of you agree with me.
It's all right, Scotty.
Scotty.
But I mean, you also consider, we talk about, the big giant exodus, and it's, and the amount of time period and all that. And you have to think about in a way, people who started, from Egypt in the Exodus stories, they're more than likely not going to be there towards the end. If you consider like the average lifespan, it was like people lived until the 30s, and they were in the desert or wherever, or
40 years.
For more than 40 years. So it's a generational thing that that's been passed on from from the adults to certainly their children. They were raised a certain way to become either warriors or whatever, craftsmen or whatever you want to.
Well, clearly in that span of time, there would have been people that only knew wandering in the desert.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Kids born after the Exodus. Like I was saying, a year or two after the Exodus began, and they're born into the family. And by the time they're 38 to 40 years old, they've been wandering in the desert. And that's all they've known is that nomadic lifestyle.
And even with people who wander in the desert and, have certain amount of skills, you're going to see their impact as they move, which, you were arguing for the archaeological, imprint and all that. Because, of course, there's some form of trade,
Yes.
Some either trade or evolution of, acquiring of different skills and tasks and all that stuff. It's like, I don't know if you're familiar with the Diary of Mirror.
No.
Well, I mean, essentially the Diary of Mirror was supposed to have the explanation of how certain cultures were able to move, giants, tons and tons of stone and all that stuff, that technology. So that sort of evolution, and I know you've on a previous show you saw those pictures of the the altar and
yes,
near the black the altar of I forgot the name, it's escaping me. Near the black mountains and all that.
Right.
At not Gobble the the buildings of similar altars with the same type of stonework, so there is that technology, that knowledge, it's being passed around into different areas, which is suggestive. It's not evidence at this point, but I mean it's suggestive of definitely movement. So that's basically what I was trying to say. Yeah. So I mean we see that sort of what do you call it, that spreading of different things. There was a friend of mine was who's doing research. He was trying to find links between places such as Egypt, ancient Egypt, and Ireland, for example. There was evidence of they were finding types of necklaces and beadwork that was made from belonged to, I think, either a princess or a woman or somebody of high rank, that we had that type of technology and beadwork that was found in places like Ireland. So we know there's definitely travel through boats and all that stuff. So the main thing is that we're not in a we're not living in when we read biblical narratives or different type of narratives, we tend to think of it as being isolated in a bubble. We're seeing from one point of view. And then like we were saying last night, not just from the Hebrew and Egyptian perspective, there's going to be other people in the area, other groups who may have been witnessing to these events and may have recorded down. We have yet to come across a lot of that. That's where we can track everything, like you would track social media nowadays. Where everybody's doing at once. Could you have track their movements? The amount of information is goes really quickly nowadays as opposed to back then where
yeah.
the amount of passing around. So, but it happens. I mean, regardless,
Yes.
regardless of the speed, it still goes around. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, that's some good insight. I appreciate that. I don't have
Evening,
much to
Niall.
add to that. What's that, Dave?
I said evening, Niall.
Oh,
Hello, Dave. Hi, sir.
I know.
so all those of you, by the way, who've come into the chat room, welcome to the show. This is the captain's cabin, and we stay on for a little bit. We'll see what tonight is like. So
Yeah,
I'm not so out of sorts tonight.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on about what Sarah said. She's absolutely
Yeah.
right. There's,
Can I get that recorded?
yeah, yeah. And by the way,
I go, what was that?
Witnessing
yeah, I can, myself and Sarah have said a few words to each other, which I regret totally. And I think she's a wonderful person. And I'm glad to see her here tonight. I just wanted to open the floor to her because she's very insightful, much more than I ever gave her credit for. And I'm sorry about that, Sarah. So that's out there now, forever and a day.
All right.
When
we'll
it comes
remember
to yes, yeah. When it comes to what you said, the history of the movements of people, right? I'm not an expert on the Egyptian side of things. I've always had a kind of an issue with Egypt and Egyptology, probably because it's too overexposed and people get too excited about it, and it's kind of like the central hub of civilization and all this kind of stuff. The movements of people really excite me though, because it's quite obvious where people travel, and when they try and hide their documentation, for want of a better word, whether it's oral or written, about something really distressful that is happening to them, and it's like a message that has been passed through, and that people who are really serious about whatever topic it is, whether you're talking about Christianity, Judaism, I suppose you could call it Egyptology or whatever, all these different aspects of history, they always start with a hidden aspect, because they have to hide things, they have to retranslate things, they have to, like you were talking earlier on, Scotty, about I can't pronounce those names from those names.
Yeah. Some of them are just
it's just not my thing. I'm more of a European guy. I just don't get it. But it's the same principles always apply. It's like, this is important information that has to be carried on to a next generation. Why? We don't really know, but it's kind of important. So we're going to pass it down. We're going to hide it. I used an analogy in the chat room of the travels of the Turin Shroud, which traveled all around Europe and elsewhere, and the Near East and the Far East, and came back, and it popped up in engravings and stuff like that. But academia was like, no, we still, the jury's still out on the Turin Shroud. Even though it's quite obvious,
right?
This is an important,
Yes.
very important. What is it? What is it? How important is it?
It's an artifact. It's a relic. It's a whatever you want to call it.
It might well be. It might well be the face of Jesus Christ.
Might.
Well, even though the scientists, talking about the Turin Shroud for a moment, the scientists, when they were let in there, by the Vatican at this stage, were able to decipher that the linen that this was made from, when the plants died, that the actual linen was actually compressed into, existed right around the time of Jesus' death, when they were like, oh no, that's rubbish. See, academia has a way of really confusing the issue. They do it because they want funding, and same especially with Egypt. They do it all the time with Egypt, and because they want funding to keep things flowing along an academic line, especially an academic line that somebody can put their name to a book to, okay? Or, can convince some university or some major corporation to finance work that they want their name attached to. So this is not necessarily to do with your work.
Yeah.
Or
There are some crossovers,
there's definite crossovers. And if you
I've
read
written
enough
books. It'd be nice to have money coming in the door off of the things that I do. If this radio show produced income, I'd spend a hell of a lot more time with it.
Yeah.
And
I think that what this topic really does qualify for me is that people hide things for reasons, and journeys can be accessed, but you have to look for the information, and you have to look for the travels can be easily interpreted once you know what you're looking for. Like Sarah mentioned something about in Ireland, we have a very similar culture to the Native American culture of America. We're a mound culture. We build things in mounds.
Yes.
Okay. So all of we're kind of like dwarves, we kind of go from the earth up, and we build things in perfect alignment, very similar, amazingly, to the Giza complex and its orientations, with the equinoxes, etc., etc. They're precise, and they're underground. There's a tiny little opening, and but we're a mound culture. We don't build up. We kind of build upish and downish, up and downish. And these people, the written confirmations of this were not written in not like the ex-canon texts or in Christian law or Judaic law, but they were written in oral Passovers. But the idea of the she or the little people or the good people were the carriers of the message, and they were very powerful. Their entire land was kind of convinced to move in certain areas or away from certain lands or towards certain lands, depending on what the fairy folk demanded.
Right.
And so you could put that down to superstition. You could put that down to, and they would try and etch these movements into stone. In Newgrange, in Wexford, in Ireland, they have these huge monoliths, they have this kind of strange maps. It's like a snake-like thing, which kind of leads from one area to another. They have these strange markings, which no one has ever been able to decipher. Which leads to it's kind of like built on leylands and all this kind of stuff. So my point is, there's an awful lot of superstition and stuff like that, which turns out to be true. It turns out that the great movements of people over millennia tend to go through the same kind of procedure of extreme trauma and trying to put it down in some way that the future generations can understand.
Yes.
Some way that it can be deciphered and thought about and extended upon. And I think all over the world is we see examples of this. Egypt, is like awash with it. But unfortunately, academia kind of shuts all of these kind of insightful and thought-provoking kind of obvious comparisons, across cultures and how peoples move from one area to another, conquest, and how that affects it, and where they move down, and what happens, and what's left behind, and what happens to the. So I just wanted to jump on and say that I think that all of this is kind of obvious. Like even today, I was reading, from a Christian point of view, about Matthew and the concepts of heaven and hell, and about the Apocalypse of Peter, which is an actual book, which is originally called the Apocalypse of Peter, where he talks about heaven and hell. These are ex-canon gospels, which I'm only getting into now because some of them were found in Ethiopia, some of them
Right.
in various other places, and I have to go searching for these writings from these ex-academicians, or usually professors of some college or another, who got kicked out because they weren't towing the line. In other words, there is a big cover-up of the truth of the movements of cultures around the world, and all of that gets mixed up in divinity. I think divinity is in there somewhere, but unfortunately, academia is the worst enemy of truth. Yeah. And I was happy to see Teresa in the chat room tonight, because I know she's into the Egyptian side of things. So I just wanted to add my 2 cents about that. Does that make any sense?
No, that's perfect. I appreciate it. I appreciate even the meanderings a bit. That's always fun. And speaking of that, we've got some people saying things in the chat room, maybe in a little bit, Pearson Castile, if we're still on. And when we drift off of this topic, maybe we'll talk about that a bit. Radio, ham radio. I got to tell you, ham radio to me used to be a lot more interesting, and it had its mystique in the days before the internet, because you could tune in this radio and pick up these stations or these people talking from all the way around the world, places you never heard of before, and obscurity and mysterium obscurity. And until, of course, the internet came along, and now it's ham radio isn't so mysterious anymore. But
now we have spirit boxes and oval.
That's right. That's right.
We're talking.
I always thought you were the best talk show host, late night talk show host, because you have that voice, Scotty.
Oh, me?
Yes, yes.
Night sounds.
Yes, yes.
For night sounds.
Yes.
Let's get our harpist, Margaret, to play something enchanting that will take over and assuage the negative powers of the day. So sit back with me for night sounds.
Now,
going back.
I don't care who you are. I would listen to your radio show with that voice.
Well, thank you.
Going back to ancient peoples, I mean, and it's not when you with the Exodus, you're having movement of extremely large amount of people. Yeah. So, I mean, you also have to consider, and I guess, archaeologically, you'll always find evidence of, how is that population going to be supported in terms of logistics, because, they have to be fed, they have to be watered, they're, most likely taking cattle.
Manna, duh. Well, I mean, seriously, that's the biblical story anyway. So
manna provided from aliens.
From aliens, from God,
possibly.
And so quails. What did it say? They ate quails and flocks of quails and things like that. But I certainly have a tough time believing there were anywhere from 2 to 6 million people wandering. That's an awful lot of people to wander nomadically through the desert,
considering how much fresh water and stuff they were
eating.
I mean, but we have to also assume that the landscape the way it is now is not what it was like then. I mean, yes, there were deserts, but there could have been more plant life.
What's it call it? It calls it the wilderness of Sinai as opposed to the desert of Sinai.
Right.
So who knows what was there?
Yeah, because I mean, even allegedly, there's some archaeological people believe that that's where Eden used to be, or prior to the fall. So I mean, that was a considerably lush area. So
exactly, Sarah. That's a good point. And that's another correlation. Everything kind of ties in together with these mythos stories, you know.
Right.
And I had always placed Eden up in what is now let's see if you're looking at it, northwest of Iran.
Right.
And because some of the name places are still the same, some of the rivers are the same names. So you had to ask the question: did the names of the rivers, as we see them recorded now, did they come from that story, or did that story come from the rivers that were there? Who knows? You know, it talks about the.
Well, I mean, you would have to also consider, you know, the continental drift and movement of because that could be different. There could have been pathways that were evident at that during time, which are not there anymore now. So
right.
I think it says.
Well, and rivers move; they meander and drift from place to place from time to time. So, and you're talking thousands of years ago. So,
yeah. But one thing is for sure that current day Iran and Iraq would seem to be the kind of epicenter of a lot of these movements, either to or from or through. And it's a very important part of the world. Would that have been called Mesopotamia back in the? No, that was more the Greek side of things. What was that area of land called around Iraq and Iran?
Well, that was Asia Minor, so you're probably looking at, you know, it's Mesopotamia, but
Mesopotamia. Yeah. I think there was a lot of these travelings around that part of the world to and from that kind of that was like an epicenter of extreme movement and extreme kind of knowledge that was hidden, esoterica, all of these kind of things, and that has to mean something. So it's obviously the traveling of people who met other peoples and try to write things down or try to retain information in some way. It wasn't always successful, and then, you know, it's hidden away, and then it turns up years later in some other context, and academia gets a hold of it and turns the whole thing on its head. Yes. So, you know, the travel of the Israelites is a perfect example. The truth is, it's like Occam's razor. The truth is probably exactly as you presented it. All those landmarks that you mentioned in your presentation, that's exactly how it happened. There's no other explanation. You know, when you kind of point out, well, this A follows B, follows C, follows D. Yeah, this was here and this. Okay, well, that, you know, no, but that didn't happen. Yeah, that didn't happen.
Right.
You know, and it's the same with the biblical narratives. You draw a certain amount out of it, and you kind of go, I'll put that to one side, and you draw a certain amount out of another narrative, and you put that to one side, and all of a sudden you have a narrative that makes sense, and it has to do with the communications over the ages, which are basically saying more or less the same thing. Sometimes about life after the afterlife, sometimes about heaven and getting closer to God, sometimes about hell and Hades and damnation, sometimes about the something they don't understand but they just want to pass on, which we assume might be some godlike description. But, you know, it always comes down to the same kind of nomadic movement of peoples across vast tracts of land, and they try to leave messages behind when they can. And the only thing that frustrates me about those messages that are left behind is that academia kind of a lot of times suppresses it for their own nefarious.
And you know,
well,
go ahead, Dave.
Never deny academia the ability to screw things up. You know, take a look at, like, we're going to jump way forward in our timeline. Okay. Currently working a lot with Viking reenactment, and you have these hardliners that if it's not in a burial find, you can't use it. And I'm like, well, wow, that's really limiting. Because there's only
we were
so
talking
many,
about tonight a little bit.
so many burial finds. Look at so one of the things I point out, like boot height. Okay, they have lots of examples of small shoes and 2-button boots, which are basically ankle high. Okay, and not a lot of like knee height boots, and yet it's not a huge uncommon thought. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of somebody that was grown up in Minnesota. Short boots are great in the summertime, but in the wintertime, you want a boot that's taller because nothing's worse than having snow down in your shoe.
That's right.
Okay. And so they're like, well, we don't have burial finds of a lot of tall boots. And I'm like, well, maybe that's because when Lars died, his best friend said, whoa, Lars was like a brother to me. He'd want me to have his boots. He can have these shoes for his burial, and I'm going to keep those boots, or when you look at the blade quality of some of the weapons they're buried with, they're not the greatest. Now, there are some examples of some truly amazing weapons.
Yes.
But those are usually with the kings or people like that. And one would think, if I've got a really amazing piece, I'm going to pass it down to my son or my best friend or my brother is going to take that sword and say, he can have mine for the burial. I'll use this.
Yeah.
And some of those best things are kept out of the burial for generations to the point where they're no longer useful. Okay. And I look at the Victorians. The Victorians, even writing about the Tudors, got almost everything wrong. And the Tudors were amazing record keepers.
Yeah.
There's huge
like how can you
amounts
get it
of
wrong if you
documents.
look at the records they kept?
Yeah. And
Absolutely. And talking about the Vikings, Dave.
Yeah.
The Vikings were here.
Yeah, they were.
And we have a.
Oh, he's in Ireland. He means in Ireland.
No, I understand that.
Yeah,
that.
We have a complete longship, which was they're putting up a set of apartment blocks, and all of a sudden some guy said there's a piece of wood sticking out here, and the archaeologists were called in, and we had this kind of huge longship, and beside it we dug up some graves. And all of a sudden, this was back in the 80s, right?
Right.
Academia was all over it all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But we had some graves. I've seen some photographs. It was shown on television, but just as a by the by. Oh, yeah, the Vikings were here. We found some evidence. But the actual evidence was extremely... Whoever survived that journey, because we're at the extreme eastern end of Europe, so that the Vikings had traveled down via Scotland, down through the Irish Sea, and they had traveled up the River Liffey into Dublin and made a settlement there. But I think there was some cataclysm that happened. I think they were worn out at that stage, or maybe they were ill, but the boat kind of basically crashed against the side of the river and just sunk. And there was a number of graves of warriors who were side by side with their swords across their chests. It's now in the National Museum of Ireland, and some daggers, and no sign of what happened to the Vikings after that. So they made it into Ireland. They made it up the river from Scotland, but they were pretty much decimated at the stage. But the longship they have recreated, and they still have either end of it, because obviously the middle was completely and utterly devastated. But they do have either end of the longship that came up the river from the eastern coast of Scotland right down to the Irish Sea and right into Dublin, where this long boat, they think it was only one, just made it up so far, and most people died, including all the warriors. But that we have, in our National Museum, we have evidence of all the swords and all the trinkets and the jewelry and stuff like that. So
that's beautiful.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? But that's true.
But you look at the Victorians and what they, they just made stuff up out of whole cloth. Like you needed a crane to lift a knight in armor onto a horse and all this stuff. In full armor, you can do somersaults and all kinds of, maneuvers. You're not immobile. You'd be
Yeah.
useless if you were immobile. You can mount and dismount easily from a horse in full armor, and it's as though they just didn't bother to read any of the records that were there and just made stuff up. And they were relatively close in the period that they were writing about. Even when they wrote about the Scots of the 1700s, and they were in the 1800s, people that were only 70 to 100 years earlier than them, they were wrong. And so isn't it amazing that the academics now think they know exactly what happened 2,000 years ago, and if you have any straying thoughts, you're ludicrous for promoting them.
That's a brilliant point,
Right.
because the flexibility of armor, right, was one thing. If you go back to the Arthurian legends, right, Excalibur was a big movie over here. Right?
Oh, are you thinking of the scene I'm thinking of?
All right, but the armor on these guys was always, they were moving like RoboCop.
Yeah.
When they were off their horse, they could hardly move. They were like, ka-chung,
And
ka-chung, ka-chung,
I don't know if you've
ka-chung.
ever worn a suit of armor, but it's not that way.
No, it's not that way. But that was a deliberate. That was a deliberate kind of finger up to the English. It's a bit like you come out here, we're running around in robes, and you're trying to take over this village, and you're walking like a robot, so you're going to be ka-chung, ka-chung. And even King Arthur, when he's putting the stone in the sword, he's going up that hill like like he's a goddamn robot who weighs about 20 tons, and all the other knights are trying to get up the hill after him, and all the armor is weighing them down. You know the scene, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the truth is, the armor was much more lightweight, and there was hinges, and your knees were left free, and your elbows were left free, and your neck was left free. So you weren't like this, you weren't surrounded by this kind of robotic.
And here, the Victorians had access. I've been to the museums. All that armor still exists. Okay, the Victorians had access to it. They could have put it on. And I shake my head at the things Victorian historians wrote about the earlier periods, because it is so wrong. And modern day historians are like, well, I'll just go put that. Well, wow, these guys were wrong. Look how mobile this is. And it's like, if we can do it, why didn't they do it? What was their? I just don't understand.
Well, I'll explain why. Because the Victorians didn't like the idea of open warfare. They liked the idea of chivalry, just the pure sight,
right,
of this monster on top of another monster. It's like, I shouldn't even have to get off my horse to engage you in battle. You should just surrender. So the Victorians had this idea of, that's why they like monarchy so much. They like this idea of, this is below us. So we don't have to worry about whether my armor will actually, sustain me in battle. I wouldn't dare be engaged in battle. That's why they like to promote the whole idea of being shrouded in this glistening silverish spacesuit, for want of a better word,
right.
Which you wouldn't dare go near. But if somebody said, get off that horse and fight me, they'd be clanking all over the place, and that was the image that they wanted to portray. So the actual idea that this armor was relatively maneuverable was something that they had to downplay. And when I say, the images that you see are always of this heavily armored knight. Even all you have to do is with the lances that you go through.
Right, jousting
the
and
lances.
stuff.
All you have to do is hail to that historically accurate masterpiece of a movie, A Knight's Tale, with Heath Ledger.
Oh my
Yeah.
God!
And
Oh my eyes!
he did wear some lightweight armor in that one.
Yeah, but the truth of it is that the English
Point is gone.
did present a lot of the frontline armies of the time dressed like this, but they weren't called upon to fight. They were just there for.
You want to read a great book, and you may have already, Niall. You're an avid reader. I was mentioning a couple of weeks ago how I like the works of Bernard Cornwell. And he's a historical fiction writer, and he writes a lot of books. He wrote Sharp's Rifles and Sharp, the character Sharp, and all of that. That was made into a series a long time ago. But he wrote his book Agincourt about Henry V and his invasion of France. And he focuses on one of his characters as a Boyeur and bowman in battle.
Oh, a Boyeur. Oh.
What did you think I said?
Voyeur.
Boyeur. Yeah, a voyeur. They were the knights that would run around and look in people's windows. But they were talking about how the rains had hit that field the night before the big battle, and how it was all engulfed in mud, and you had all these French armored knights that were weighed down in the muck and the mire that could not fight. Their horses were.
Not unlike Waterloo.
What's that?
Not unlike Waterloo.
Exactly. And then you had all the Boyeurs who were, they said a lot of them were barefoot. They didn't have the armor. They had to be lightweight. They were shooting arrows into the armies. And they would have to go, when they would get into hand-in-hand combat with some of these knights who were in the much heavier armor, they could trounce them in the mud because they didn't have the extra weight of armor. Probably the more limited movements of armor.
Yeah, but the basic idea of armor from the English constabulary point of view was protection for the nobility. It was not a mainstay of the knights. Even the jousting competitions are pretty much. That's not how it happened. You didn't have this huge guy, in black visors, and they were coming down and knock you off the horse. It was a representation of nobility.
Well, jousting armor is completely separate from combat armor.
Yeah, but if one of those guys had to get off, by the way, there's not many horses would be prepared to carry a weight of that size. Anyway,
Pertrons and things like that. Yeah, they're big horses.
So what you see in Excalibur with all these huge knights with swinging their swords around, that's ridiculous. But that is what is presented, like St. George fighting the dragon. The suit of armor did not become a defense mechanism. It became like almost
status,
like a status rank. Yeah, and a sense of royalty, and also something to scare the enemy. Because mostly, barefoot peasants would be scared shitless by these silvery machines on horseback. But these guys did not engage in battle because they couldn't. Because all you have to do is go over and push them in the chest, and they'd fall over. Sheer gravity would take them over.
Sure.
If they swung a sword at you, if they missed.
If you lost your balance, you were done.
You were done. So and I've no doubt that suits of armor. I'd love to have one here in my apartment. I'd love to have one of those full sets of armor because they did.
You've got one in your apartment?
I could get one.
He would like to have one.
Absolutely, because they were fabulous works of art. But it was all about the appearance and
sure.
Well, in the period where Arthur would have actually fallen, mythical or not, he wouldn't have had armor like that. It wouldn't have existed yet.
Closer to 10th, 11th century armor in that movie, and they're just trying to portray a character who supposedly lived in the 500s to 600s.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to employ a guy and say, "Listen, I want something that's going to protect me from arrows and swords and axes and whatever," can you design me something? I think that's a very bad design, to put something on a guy who's going to be like this. Okay.
Sure.
Okay,
There's truth to that.
But it's not like that, Niall. It's so much more flexible. The weight is distributed across the whole body. It's not.
That's
not
my point, Dave.
encumbering
You're
like
right.
that.
You're right. Yeah.
And of course, as Dave said, you were talking jousting armor was a very different thing. So,
in the same way that when you look at sports equipment is designed to protect the vital areas and stuff. It's not the kind of clothing we would wear every day. Obviously, we don't walk around with shoulder pads and shin guards and helmets and all this kind of stuff. But the jousting armor, you had reinforced panels where the lance was supposed to hit, all designed because it's a sport competition. It was never designed to be lethal. In at least in the jousting competition, yes, fighting with a lance in combat was designed to be lethal, but when they're doing it in a tournament, they're trying to protect the person inside that armor as much as possible. The goal is to knock somebody off the horse or to break a lance, not to break the other knight.
Yeah, but my point was there were members of the royalty who used to wear full armor, like in jousting competitions, just to frighten the enemy, but they would not engage in battle. That was my point earlier on. They used to put these guys in full heavy armor on horseback and just put them there, and they would walk around with a flag, and designed to intimidate the opposition. So the armor was there, and they used to use it in jousting for a different reason, but in battle, these guys weren't fighting in that kind of armor. The armor that they were actually fighting in was much more versatile. They had hinges for the knees, they had hinges for the elbows, they had movements around the neck. You had the helmet was pretty clever the way they did it, because you could up and down and you could move across, and it wouldn't go into your ears. So somebody shoved a knife into the side of your head, you could turn around. And so those, that's what armory was. Armory was an art. So these big bulky guys like we saw in Excalibur were only those suits of armors did exist, but they existed for nobility to make their appearance at battle scenes, and they would just be there at the front of the ranks and they would draw, and it was purely to frighten the enemy. And then in jousting, but that's where the myth sprung from, that every Englishman or every Frenchman, not really French, but every Englishman would wear a suit of armor like a jousting suit of armor. But there were two totally separate myths that kind of merged into one, So,
Scott Allen, I'm going to jump into this shifting topic again, back to the topic of the show tonight. Scott Allen asked, if you look at a map, why did it take 40 years? I don't think it took 40 years. I think they wandered as a nomadic tribe for 40 years. They weren't really, it was like God forbade them to go into the promised land for 40 years.
Like getting lost in Disneyland.
Yeah. You could take 40 years wandering Disneyland. Yeah, we're gonna wander over here and live in a Toyland park for a while. So.
It was a really long queue.
Yeah. Yeah, really. So
let's go back to they're there for 40 years. They're living on manna, and Moses comes down with food laws. What?
Yeah, food laws.
Bacon sounds really good now. Wait a minute.
Yeah. We can't have pork. Where did you find pork? So, you found pork?
Turkey came after.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, Moses supposedly died as they were entering the conquest of the land. So if he wrote all that Levitical law, he's writing about, again, the kids who grew up during the wandering in the wilderness. Yeah. Those kids growing up, they're you had a thing. What, you ate these things? What happened?
Tell me again about lobsters. No, we can't eat lobsters. Shut up.
No, none of that. There'll be none
Not
of the
with milk.
shellfish. No.
Not with milk. But
There's no
if I could,
shellfish here in the desert. So,
but if I can make a point, I mean, not just in
please.
the what do they call not Levantine, but Levant area or any area in history. It, what historians have to do today is they have to kind of get in the mindset of the people, and there's always a thing about context, because there's no when with the records that we're able to get, they're not objective. They're certainly not. I mean, everybody had their own.
Everybody had their take.
Yeah, they had their own agenda. They'll make themselves look better than what they actually were. All that sorts of things, and even the continued evolution of different religions. They promote certain ideals versus other ideas. Versus other ideas, like you see how major powerhouses like the Catholic Church or any other church has sort of evolved out of that. They maintain certain elements of control over the group through social contract or whatever means, or whatever wheeling and dealing in what was going on in the background.
Sure.
Even especially in the cases when there was the interaction between Christians and the Romans. They had to abide by Roman rules and still try to maintain their own identity, even though most of them have been treated by second-class citizens or whatever. So I mean, if you look at the history as opposed to their view, the Roman view of the Hebrew people versus the Hebrew people view on the Romans, it's going to be very different. And saying, oh, we were, being merciful to a certain group, or they were being oppressive to another group, or where they couldn't, practice openly or whatnot.
Right.
So and along the way, you also have to consider the fragments that we've discovered of like different apocryphal teachings and stuff that like we were talking about. Yes, they were hidden. We're finding jars.
But they add new pieces to the puzzle, so you have to look at them.
Yeah, and you have to look at the context of it as well.
Yeah.
If you look at like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or those scrolls that are found in a jar in a desert, that's been sealed for whatever period that they dated at.
Yep.
By the way, I just have to mention that Pearson Castile got the Monty Python reference. So thank you, Pearson.
No, you're absolutely right, sir. It's like the witches of the 16th century. The Salem witch trials and all this kind of stuff. The Catholic Church got a wind of this. Bunch of crazy women who were running around the woods and worshiping nature and stuff. What were they up to? They were worshiping nature. They were pagans. And they were questioned under the Inquisition because they were doing something really bizarre, mostly having affairs with the local bishop's wife or husband, or vice versa. They were kind of free-spirited people. They were like the hippies of their days, basically. And the church was like, this isn't very good for morale, because they're disrupting church services. Mostly, they could have been swelling from some of them could have been mentally ill, and this isn't just limited to Salem, it's all over England or whatever. But it turned out that the witches were saying that the brews that they were making, it allowed them to, it was basically psychedelic stuff they were kind of dabbling with, and the church didn't like this idea. So they said, listen, we have to make this diabolic in some way. So we have to make sure that these women, mostly women, who are wandering around half naked in the woods, or gathering together in circles and making these brews, they're calling up the devil himself. And we will question these women about how they are calling up the devil. And they says, well, we just take some plants and we boil them up, and the church is like, no, that doesn't sound right. I mean, if you just have to boil a few plants to call up the devil. What sort of a devil is that? You know, the devil is just supposed to appear. You know, you don't need to boil a few plants to make the devil appear. So all of a sudden that corresponded to the Catholic Church saying that the devil was made appear, not through plants, you know, because that's too, you know, it's too effete, you know, it's like, and you were sacrificing babies. Oh yes, you were sacrificing babies. Yeah. Oh, that's much better than boiling plants. You know, all of a sudden that you were in league with the devil. So
you would think
know,
in a small village like that, you would notice missing babies.
You'd think.
Well, I mean, I
you'd be
did quite
surprised.
yeah.
You'd be surprised if someone took your baby away and said, "Well, we have to take this baby away." It depends on, you know, in context, as Sarah was saying. In context, anything could have happened during the Dark Ages. Anything could have happened.
But see, this is why I like living history, because historians that just do everything based on theory and read books and write papers and stuff, they don't really understand the history the way you do when you put on the clothing, use the tools, and function in that society for a given period of time. You begin to realize, just like in real life, there are life hacks, the ways to use things and get around things and make life easier.
Yes.
And they would have done that, you know. And when you're just working in theory, you ignore all that and you go, well, this is what was written, you know.
Right.
Just like it's what Scott, how many steps in loading and firing a matchlock? It's like
19 steps.
Like 19 steps. Okay. I functioned as a musketeer for our pike company. We were a company of pike and shot. And I could do that in 4 or 5 steps in combat when we were doing battle things. There's a whole bunch of things there you just skip.
You just skip it. That was by the numbers in the ranks.
Yeah, this is how you're supposed to do it. But in reality, when you're in battle, just like in the Civil War, they learned, you know what? That ramrod isn't always necessary.
Yeah.
Half the time you're going to leave it in the barrel and shoot it at the enemy. So you might as well just not bother pulling it out.
Yeah. And there were times when Rudy Kessler said 4 rounds a minute. I could do between 3 and 4 rounds a minute. Loading
I can easily do 4 rounds a minute with a matchlock.
Yep. And we used to have where you would it's not here. That's right. It was in the old office. The musket was sitting in the corner. But you could take and you would prime your pan, then you'd pour your powder and your ball down the. You wouldn't use the ramrod. You'd
just
tap
dump
it
really hard on the ground and set it.
And you'd bring it and you'd give fire. And that was when you were in a hurry. And you could become semi-automatic by the day was pulling off 4 rounds a minute.
Right.
So
I wanted to bring up Salem for a minute because because I've done a lot of research into Salem. That was my history day project when I had to do that in school. So if you consider the context that, you know, majority of people who are coming to America or forming the colonies, they were trying to escape whatever was going on in Europe, you know, in terms of, cracking down on Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
They were considered heretics. Then they wanted to, you know, whether they were Lutheran or, you know, all the different Quakers and everybody else that was, you know, all the different groups that came over. Once they came over here, and especially in the case of the Salem witch trials, it's not just about, you know, people practicing paganism or you know, you know, these people are practicing paganism, worshiping of the devil. These were small communities, and then you had the Native American on one side, you know, where these people were encroaching on, you know, Native American land. There was some trade, depending on, you know, what group you encountered in, and they're in a totally foreign place. And the people who are accused are in the Salem witch trials. There's always that, you know, undertone of undercurrent of, you know, trying to survive and then trying to get ahead. So, such as in certain cases, like say if your neighbor had a big plot of land that was good for timber, you would accuse that neighbor, said this person is a witch. So, and then, you know,
maybe we burn her.
Right, and then
And once they're out of the way, it's like, well, no, they don't have any kin, so I'd like to purchase that land, and I'll give you 4 cents on the dollar for it, type thing.
and then it spread like wildfire. That was the
Yes.
means to socially climb up.
I hope you didn't think that I was just making light and saying that those
No,
women were.
no.
I understand. These
I
people
definitely believe
these
that
people
there was paganism involved, in the sense that there were people, the countries that they were coming from, the old ways were not dead ways.
Right.
And in many ways, they had incorporated them in with their Christianity.
Yes.
And so
holding
moonlight ceremonies and stuff to make sure the crops grew or whatever, these were not uncommon things to do.
Wasn't uncommon.
Even now in Iowa, people put warding symbols on their barns to ward off evil spells or evil people.
Right.
And these are things that came with us from the Danish and the
Dutch,
and
to say that these people were perfectly normal people who just arrived on the shores of New England is a bit deceiving.
Right.
They were Puritans, basically, so they were already really harshly stuck into their dogma, and also, you were absolutely right, Sarah. There was Indian raids going on all along the frontier of New England. That's where babies were taken and sacrificed by Indian populations, by Native Americans a lot of the time. Women were escorted away, men were killed. So all this got mixed up, in a kind of a Puritan context, which. What originally started was probably some women who were so frustrated because misogyny was rife in those days and all this kind of stuff, meeting together, getting to know their environment over a couple of decades, meeting together, maybe establishing some kind of naturistic rules that they could abide by. But of course, the authorities were all over them, because the first thing to be built in every village all around Salem and all around that area was churches and courthouses. And
sometimes one and the same.
They never had a chance.
Yeah.
They just never had a chance,
And then, not only that, but there is, like we were talking about earlier, the outside influence, because the majority of these people, if they were rich enough, they would have slaves. It's like, that you talk about in the Crucible, Tituba as a Carib slave. She's bringing her culture in. And the Europeans themselves, they had their own culture, whether it's
from Haiti,
poppets and medicinal herbs.
By the way, she lived to old age, by the way.
She did.
Yeah.
She ran off.
Yeah. So, what we would consider, a healthy soup, with herbs would be considered magic, back then.
My point was about the Salem witch trials. You're absolutely right, Sarah. Absolutely right in everything you said. But my point about summoning the devil himself, we can't do it through plants. That sounds too weak. The devil has to, he has to be, you have to have sacrifices, and it has to be really dramatic. So we have to make this out to be the devil. You have to sell your soul to that was a Catholic invention.
That was built on a culture of fear and paranoia.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, because the devil is considered, opportunistic, in that,
and you certainly don't need a plant to call him up,
Right.
Well,
of course, and then the big question is, and we'll have to do this sometime when we're not overtime in the captain's cabin, but we should talk about the whole notion, and I say notion because it's speculative, it's theological speculation, but the whole idea that Satan, what makes him the epitome of all that is dark and evil, and goats with fangs and men with hooves and stuff like that? Satan was the angel, the most beautiful created being. It doesn't say, and God distorted his looks when he when he fell.
No,
It
he did
just-
that to Moses. He did that to Moses.
Moses. There you go.
But,
And he said, but he did say, sorry, sir. He did say all he wanted to do. It was his pride, and God cast him down. And
Sounds
so-
like my kind of show.
would Satan enjoy a good game of Monopoly? Would Satan enjoy?
Of course he
He
would.
probably invented.
Like to go fishing with you sometime? Is it all about I'm coming fishing with you because I just want to steal your soul, or is
Yeah,
it I like to fish too? I'm just the king of evil.
Well,
Or would he have been,
term-
let's go get our nails done?
Yeah. Our hooves done.
Yeah, the term Satan, means adversary. It means adversary, and when you look at the,
It also means if you call him Lucifer, it's light bringer. So it's kind of
that's
That's
Morning
right.
Star.
That's
Yeah,
right,
that was
yes.
Morning Star.
Does this shade of red
So-
make my horns look big?
But,
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the characterization of Satan, the horns, the cloven hooves and stuff. That is
tail.
depending on where the source is coming from. That's an amalgamation of representation of surrounding countries. Like
well,
if you-
it's
if you
Pa.
were
It's
afraid
Pa.
of-
It's
yeah.
Greek. It's Pa.
yeah,
It's,
Sure.
that
Yep.
could the cloven hooves can come from Pan.
And I don't want to be.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be blasphemous to those to whom believe that. That's not my point here. And my point is, do we really know that what we're taught is how much of that has our own perceptions of things and our own evolution of our perceptions of things really changed the way we think and view things?
I mean,
is
if you look at the iconography, iconography is different than what we consider, Satan.
heaven and hell.
Actually,
There it
is.
is.
Some people believe
Brad
that,
Ehrman.
Satan is all around us, all
Mm-hmm.
opportunistic, invisible, or whatever. Or
no, it's yeah.
or you have, if you're going to depict it in a story or trying to
Yeah.
conceptualize it to other people, then you may
It's-
create an icon of saying this is what Satan looks like, and this is what he represents. It's creating that context of
That context.
construct,
And again,
of representing a certain set of ideals.
this particular book by Ehrman is not
Ehrman
based
is
on
amazing.
there is a heaven, there is a hell. It's a construct, he argues, of later times, because Jesus never mentioned. Matthew mentions it.
I agree with that.
But it's distorted and accentuated as the centuries go on. So
Yes.
I read these things because I'm fascinated by how much, especially in 2022, we still believe in a physical heaven and a physical hell, especially amongst Americans. A massive population who still believe in the actual devil, and the actual angels. But there is something also. There's a crossover with all traditions and all cultures, including Islam, including the jinn, and about the beautiful ones who have fallen. And there is some kind of a romantic notion. So I think that's a very good idea to explore that, Scotty.
I'd like to explore it more.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
again, there's some people in our audience that are going to think I'm really treading on dangerous theological ground.
Not at all.
And
not
others
at all.
are going to say, well, that's interesting. I'd like to hear that.
It's context, as
It
Sarah
is
said.
context. It
Yeah.
is. Well, we'll leave it at that for tonight.
Okay.
Gang, thanks for being here.
Good chatting with you.
Always a pleasure.
With you too.
Talk to you soon.
And so I'm going to let you all go. And I thank you for being here. And have a good night, Sarah. Good to have you here.
Night,
Glad
guys.
you're here.
Take
Talk
care.
to you soon.
Bye-bye.
And Niall, the same. You have a good day ahead of you. I don't know if you sleep until 1 in the afternoon or if you're up now for the day.
No.
So
I'll do a few laps,
there it is. There it is.
All right. I'll see you
Have
later.
a good day, brother. And Dave, Uncle Dave, you have a good day. Good to have
Just
you.
want
over
to say to
today.
everyone that painting will commence soon,
Yes.
and you are going to be amazed at what we do with those concrete walls.
Yes. Yes. I believe so. So that's it. That's all we got. Dave, I'll see you later.
All right.
All right. And folks, thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this broadcast. You don't know how much it means to me that you are here and that you give me your time. So for the meantime, we're just going to get out of here. So live long and prosper.